$2 million theft, but the truth was unstoppable. On her first day, Amara opened a spreadsheet and watched $2 million vanish on her login on her screen, with the security cameras conveniently down. The manager pointed, HR murmured policy, and the building's silence felt like a verdict. Was it incompetence, sabotage, or something colder? Don't look away. The final frame flips every certainty you're holding by day's end. By the time Amara reached the security desk at 8:13 on a Tuesday, she had already been measured. The lobby gleamed with brass and marble, the kind of shine that tells you money has its weather, and in that air the guard's smile was courteous, practiced, almost tenderly distant. He repeated her name as if testing a foreign coin for authenticity, then handed over a badge that felt heavier than plastic should, as though it carried not just permission to enter, but a wager on whether she would last. She had imagined this entrance 100 times. The elevator's soft chime, the hush of carpet, the view spilling open at the top floor where glass met sky. She had earned the right to be here with a scatter of early mornings and late nights. Numbers balanced to the penny, models that predicted risk in 6 decimal places, a master's degree stitched together with scholarship and grit. Yet as she crossed the threshold, the quiet told a different story. Faces turned, polite and unstartled, offering smiles that glided across her like rain on wax. She knew this temperature. It lived in the space between welcome and doubt, in the half-second longer someone takes to look you over when you are the only black woman in a room that believes it is objective. The elevator filled with people who belonged to one another through habit. A vice president said, "Welcome aboard," and mispronounced her name without pausing to hear the correction. A woman with a neat bob asked where she was from, in a tone that suggested the answer shouldn't be here. Amara kept her breath measured and her answers plain. She had learned long ago that the first day in an unfamiliar room is a negotiation between truth and survival, and that some truths can wait. Ethan, her manager, met her with a handshake that set a boundary. Firm, unsmiling, a quick glance at the resume he already knew by heart, then a nod toward a desk near the printer. The windows were for others. He offered the tour in clipped sentences that sounded like policies. "We move fast here. We expect precision. We rely on fit." He said it fit the way a tailor says it before explaining what will be cut away. She thanked him, took her seat, and felt the small hum of the building in her spine, a current you ignore until it becomes the only thing you hear. The first meeting began at 9. Slides bloomed across a wall-sized screen, numbers as tall as doorways. She recognized patterns in the data immediately, a flaw in a forecast dressed up as certainty, and when she pointed to the edge case that could become the headline, the room performed a gentle erasure. A man 2 seats down repeated her point with a new metaphor and received nods for clarity. Someone asked her to circle back later with a memo. Ethan stacked his pens into a tidy row and said nothing. The correction had landed. The credit had moved on. She wrote it down anyway and kept her voice steady, refusing the old invitation to grow smaller. Bias rarely announces itself. It accumulates like dust in good light. The micro-questions, the small exclusions, the way the project calendar arrived with her name missing from a meeting she would be expected to fix afterward. In the break room, laughter gathered in familiar clusters that opened and closed without malice, just muscle memory. Someone asked whether she had seen the latest think piece about diversity, as if the topic belonged to her the way hardware belongs to the IT team. She stirred her coffee and offered an answer that did not invite a lesson. The person nodded, relieved to have been, in their mind, supportive. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who ironed uniforms and saved exact change in envelopes, who told her that rooms have histories, and that some doors open only after you have knocked long enough for the past to grow tired. "You are going to be told who you are by people who have never had to ask who they are," her grandmother had said. "Listen, if you must, then do your work." The echo of those words steadied Amara more effectively than the coffee. She straightened the papers in front of her and reminded herself that excellence is sometimes the only argument that survives the noise. At lunch, she found the cafeteria loud with habitual friendship. She carried a tray to a small table by the window and watched the city hold its breath between sirens and pigeons and crosswalk signals. A colleague approached, set down a salad, and, seeing someone else, pivoted away with an apology that tried to be weightless. The seat remained empty, a small, legible absence. Amara took a bite and decided the quiet would not be her master. She sent 2 follow-up emails that made their case. She drafted the memo no one had truly asked for and made it difficult to ignore. By late afternoon, the building's hum deepened into the low, industrious sound that means another day is being filed away. Amara shut down her laptop and saw her reflection ghosted on the black screen, serious, a little tired, unbroken. The story of the day could be told in tiny, deniable moments, each one too small to hold up to the light on its own. Together, they formed a pattern as precise as any audit. She pressed her badge into her pocket and felt again its extra weight. It would not crush her. It might even teach her how to balance something heavier than suspicion. Walking back through the lobby, she understood with a clarity that felt like fresh air that discrimination seldom begins with a slur. It begins with a culture that mistakes sameness for merit and courtesy for fairness. It begins in whispers and looks and rooms that do not notice whom they have forgotten. She stepped into the evening with her head high, knowing that tomorrow would ask the same questions in a quieter voice. She would answer with work, not because work alone will save you, but because there are days when it is the only language the room cannot pretend not to hear. An email chimed, small as a throat clear, tipped the day sideways. Amara had left her station asleep to fetch a binder thick as winter and returned to a screen awake. Wrong. A directory she did not recognize breathed open and closed as if waiting for a command. She moved the mouse, locked the machine again, and felt the quiet raise the hair on her neck. At 3:17, a neutral tone threaded the intercom, and the monitors announced a phrase that always sounds calm until it lands. Security incident in progress. The head of information security arrived with 2 analysts and the stillness of people trained to enter after damage. He asked for anyone who had touched the $200 million project within 24 hours. The circle widened, then narrowed like a lens, and found Amara's station. Ethan stepped into the lens as if built for it. He urged calm, praised process, and guided attention with the modesty of practiced control. Logs arrived like scripture. Access at 2:59 under Amara's credentials. An outbound stream, the shape of the archive, a neat sweep of deletions. The corridor camera cut to snow at 2:55 and returned at 3:04, a coincidence everyone treated like weather. Amara said she had been in the records. She described the awake screen. She had not left awake. The auditor with kind eyes asked whether she might have mistaken a system folder for something else. The lawyer asked if she had ever used a personal device after hours. A junior admin said he had seen someone leaning over her keyboard at 2:58, then amended it. Maybe only a reflection in the glass. Facts behaved like fault. Ethan offered the interview room so she could be comfortable, a word that turns containment into care. Compliance asked in straight lines. A pen made notes that looked like verdicts. When Amara said no, she said it once, cleanly, as if innocence were a language that loses strength when repeated. Across the hall, an analyst discovered a ghost account spun up in her name at 9 that morning. Used once, killed as the files vanished. Ethan exhaled gravely and promised full cooperation with the authorities. The nouns grew larger: breach, remediation, and liability, while Amara's world shrank to the size of a chair. A rumor insisted a backup camera had captured a silhouette, then died under talk of blind spots. Another rumor claimed that the archive was migrated to a foreign server, then returned to an internal sandbox. By 5, the lobby shone with the hollow brightness of a theater after credits. 2 officers waited by the revolving door, not hostile, simply institutional. Her badge, heavy all day, pressed like a coin against her palm. Inside, co-workers studied email, practicing the art of not seeing. On the sidewalk, heat lifted from the concrete with an honest smell, and the officer read her rights with efficiency that avoided cruelty and still managed to be effective. In the cruiser, she watched the city pass in pains, the morning skyline reduced to a diagram of distance. The case against her had elegance, a timestamp, a route, a camera outage, a user account that wore her name like a fitted mask. yet seems showed if you knew where to look. Her machine had woken itself. The directory had blinked and vanished like a stage cue. Someone had borrowed her work to erase her work and signed the theft with her initials. The radio crackled. The driver slowed, listening. For a breath, H thought the call might pivot the day toward reason. It was only traffic. A fender bender 3 blocks east. The car resumed its steady progress. She closed her eyes to sharpen the picture. Chair angled slightly left. Monitor brightness at 70%. Citrus cleaner on Tuesdays. A ghost on the glass when the corridor brightened at 3:30. There is a difference between being framed and being finished. One can be undone. The precinct rose ahead, a square of fluorescent certainty. As the cruiser turned, the skyline slipped behind elms and telephone lines, and a surprising thing arrived, not comfort, exactly, but leverage. The story is arranged around her loved, neat endings. She intended to interrupt its grammar. In that narrow corridor between accusation and proof, she refused the silence conspiracy requires. She would memorize everything. They dressed the day in fluorescent certainty and called it an arraignment. And still the courtroom felt like a hallway where breath goes to learn its limits. The judge's voice carried the careful cadence of someone who had measured 1,000 silences. The prosecutor rose with a file thick enough to suggest inevitability and began to speak in the grammar of proof. Motive, opportunity, method. He said Amara had accessed the archive at 2:59 p.m. with credentials that bore her name, that a ghost account created at 9 that morning had pulled a $200 million project through a narrow digital corridor, that the cleanup was so neat it looked practiced. Practice, he let the word sit there, as if competence itself were a confession. Her attorney, a decent man creased by years of hurry, leaned close and murmured that a plea could carve 20 years into something survivable. She kept her eyes on the seal above the bench and said no, because some truths cannot be traded without losing the bone beneath the skin. Voir dire had been brisk. 12 people stared back now with the wary attentiveness of those who know power has been loaned to them for a limited time and must be returned in good condition. The forensics expert, square-shouldered and scrupulous, explained chain of custody, checksum validation, and packet routes. Screens glowed with timestamps that looked like destiny. When the defense pressed the soft places the camera outage at 2:55, the way her screen had awakened itself, the intern's half-seen reflection in glass, the expert answered with modest certainty and a phrase that sounded like closure. No system is perfect, but the indicators align. Ethan arrived at the stand, in a suit that fit like an alibi. He spoke with regret polished to a shine, described mentoring programs, referenced his hopes for the defendant on day one, and the room nodded at the picture of a man burdened by duty. On cross, he adjusted nothing that could be adjusted. He agreed where agreement was safe, and declined to speculate where speculation might breed. The story he offered had the cleanliness of water poured from a bottle. In the second row, Grace Whitman watched without blinking, her stillness a refusal to be guided. The defense called Amara. She did not soften herself for consumption. She told them where she had been at 2:59, her route to the records room, the binder's weight, the citrus cleaner that announces Tuesdays on that floor, the screen she had locked, the screen she found awake, the folder that had blinked and vanished like a stage cue. She did not cry. The jury registered composure the way some people register weather, noting it without deciding whether to carry an umbrella. The prosecutor returned with questions that were short and well lit. Had she ever emailed documents to herself to study at night? Had she ever used a personal device on company premises? Did she understand corporate policy regarding removable media? Each one sounded more like defiance than innocence to ears tuned for confession. During a recess, she stood at a window where the city arranged itself into manageable rectangles. Her attorney tried again. The law, he said gently, is a tool built by people who like straight lines, and your life is curved. She thanked him and declined the mercy that would require her to sign her name to a lie. Closing arguments arrived at 4 o'clock. The government story was compact and elegant, a bridge of facts with no visible votes. The defense stitched together its realities, pointed to the blank strip of footage no one could explain, to the convenience of a ghost account that began and ended in a single workday, to the coincidence of a manager who knew exactly how to shepherd a crisis. Coincidence, he said, is a word we use when we lack the patience to follow a pattern. He asked them to be patient. The jury filed out with faces that tried not to promise anything. In the gallery, whispers moved like a drag. Grace did not move. Ethan stared at the defense table with the attentiveness of a man listening for an echo he believes he has already silenced. The clock over the bench ticked in even seconds that sounded like a machine practicing mercy. When the jurors returned, the room arranged itself into stillness. The foreman held a sheet of paper with 2 creases and a decision folded inside it. The judge asked the question that has halted more hearts than gunfire. The answer came in a voice chosen for its steadiness. Guilty as charged. The syllables were small, but they landed like iron in water, sinking beyond reach. The judge spoke of statutory minimums and maximums, of Congress and deterrence, of the arithmetic by which years are converted into policy. When the number arrived, it sat on her shoulders without mercy and with perfect balance. The bailiff's cuffs were careful, as if kindness could be measured in ounces. As they led her through the side door that smelled of old paper and mop water, Amara began the work that waits on the far side of disbelief. She catalogued the room, the notch in the witness rail, the smudge on the second pane of glass, the phrasing the judge used when he taught them reasonable doubt, the exact second the foreman blinked. Somewhere nearby, a seam had been stitched in a hurry. She intended to find it. Justice, she understood, can be turned away at the front desk and still make it up the stairs. Grace Whitman left the courtroom without offering a word to the cameras, carrying the quiet of someone who had heard a fine instrument played a half tone off. The verdict had pleased the form of justice, not its substance. In the elevator, she watched her reflection judder in the brushed steel and remembered a smaller scare years ago that taught her to invest in redundancies no one bragged about. Somewhere below the garage, a forgotten loop might still be telling the truth, because no one had gotten around to shutting it up properly. She took the service corridor to a room that smelled like cold air and dust and waited for her breath to settle before she knocked. Ruth Klein opened the door with a ring of keys and the even patience of people who fix problems for a living. Grace kept it plain. There had been a breach. The primary cameras had gone to snow at the minute that mattered. Years back, the company had installed a test spine on its power line. It was marked retired. Would Ruth see if the old thing would stir? Ruth did not waste language. She checked a fuse the way a nurse checks a pulse, pressed a recessed switch with a pen cap, and watched a shy green diode blink like a stubborn heartbeat. The unit had tried to die and only managed a nap. They fed the signal to a portable monitor and let the buffer unwind. The first frames were haze and ghost light. Then the corridor outside the project bay found its edges. At 2 to 5:05, the main camera on the schematic dropped into static, exactly as the trial described. The shadow lens kept breathing. At 2:58, a figure entered just at the lower corner of the frame, shoulders angled as if aware of the lens that was supposed to be asleep. No thumb drive, no theater. Fingers executed a sequence on Amara's keyboard that did not belong to an ordinary user. A maintenance shell opened like a trap door that had been cut into the floor years earlier and left out of the tour. At 2:59, a small square of metal flashed on a wrist. The face was not the lens, but its reflection in a framed print on the far wall, a triangle of light just patient enough to carry a jawline anyone attentive would know. Then a flick at the hallway camera control sent the primary lens into a diagnostic sleep while the shadow loop kept its plain little record. A window on Amara's machine woke. A directory opened. Files moved without a flourish. At 3:04, the corridor fell back into quiet. Grace did not allow relief to turn into noise. She asked Ruth for an image of the drive, for a hash value written twice, for a custody log in ink, and for 2 verified clones sealed and signed. Paper would matter as much as pixels. Ruth worked with practiced economy, turning the aging unit into a witness with a reliable memory. Grace called legal from the concrete corridor and used only the words that counted. Bring a portable safe. Bring someone who understands emergency motions. Bring nothing that gives anyone time to stall. Marcus arrived, still in his dinner jacket, the kind of lawyer who makes order look simple. They watched the clip again, this time with his questions threading through the steps. The timestamp matched the system clock and the building's chronometer. The power originated from the isolated line. The test spine had been documented in a memo so dull no one had politicized it. Ruth signed. Grace signed. Marcus signed. The drives were sealed. Grace kept one in her hands because sometimes the body needs the weight of what it believes. Night pressed a thin blue over the city. Traffic moved with the steady patience of people going home. Grace thought of Amara 3 miles away, counting minutes that did not belong to her, and felt her resolve settle like ballast. Her father had once told her in a union hall that leadership is not the loudest voice, but the one that knows where the fuse box is when the lights go out. She had found the fuse. Now she needed the court to allow light back in. The back entrance to the courthouse accepted them like a service door accepts a delivery. A clerk with careful manners examined the chain of custody, watched the footage twice, and made the call that brings a judge back from the evening. In a windowless room that smelled of paper and old air, they waited with an assistant district attorney whose eyes had the alertness of a man trained to pivot without losing his balance. He asked the right questions. Could software fake the irregular jitter of an older lens? Could a saboteur forge an analog time base? Ruth answered in words as plain as a hammer. The loop was hardware. The power was isolated. The buffer was offline. If this were a forgery, it would lie more beautifully than that. They ran the sequence again without commentary, just the hand, the keystrokes, the watch, the flick that sent the primary lens to sleep. The judge leaned in until the glow from the monitor colored his tie. He asked Ruth to step through a minute at a time, then a frame at a time. He sat back and let out a breath that sounded like responsibility, and asked Marcus what relief he sought. Marcus did not perform. He asked for immediate preservation orders, a hold on transport, a bail review, and an emergency hearing at first light. The orders were signed without ceremony. Somewhere, a radio crackled, and a van stopped before a gate. Grace did not smile. She stood very still and let the moment find its weight. Outside, the city kept doing what cities do. Inside, a seam in the story had opened wide enough for daylight to enter. On the ride out, she called the warden and then the appellate clerk. Each conversation a steady bridge of facts without adjectives. She pictured Amara lifting her head when the door failed to close, pictured the face in that reflected square, seeing his own outline on a very different screen. She allowed herself 1 minute of silence and then began the next task. Truth was awake, and it was not going back to sleep. They sentenced Ethan on a gray morning that made the courthouse windows look like careful paper. He stood at the lectern thinner than before, the expensive watch that had once flashed in a camera now dull under fluorescent light. The judge recited the counts in a voice that neither rose nor fell: computer fraud, obstruction, evidence tampering, conspiracy, each word landing with the matter of fact, weight of a bill come due. When asked if he wished to speak, he cleared his throat and did not look at Amara. He said he had told himself he was protecting the company, that a breach of that size required swift action, that using the tools he knew felt like leadership. Then his voice changed, smaller, truer. He said that beneath those sentences was a quieter one he had never said aloud, that he had looked at Amara on her first day and decided she would be easier to sacrifice, that he used her name because the room had trained him to believe it would be believed. He said the word prejudice without disguises, and he let it sit there between him and the record. He apologized to the court, to the company, and finally, facing the floor, to Amara for stealing not only her time, but the presumption of her honesty. He ended with a sentence that did not seek forgiveness so much as acknowledge its distance. I am sorry, and I know that sorry cannot return a single hour. The judge spoke of trust as a public utility, of systems that depend on people who could choose the hard right over the convenient wrong. He noted Ethan's admissions, his cooperation once cornered, the damage done to a life and to the confidence of many who watched. The sentence, when it came, was exact. Years in state custody, restitution, a prohibition from holding any position of fiduciary control, mandatory ethics training, not as theater but as a condition of parole, community service directed to organizations that defend the wrongly accused. The cuffs clicked with the small, honest sound of metal doing its work. There was no dramatic gasp, no drawn-out protest, just the quiet of consequence taking its seat. Afterward, outside on the steps, microphones waited like hungry birds and got a different meal. Amara did not perform a victory. She spoke with the steadiness of someone who has learned to measure words, because they can either build a room or burn it down. She thanked the court for the courage to correct itself, thanked the prosecutor for the pivot, thanked Ruth for the stubborn care that kept an old loop alive, and thanked Grace for choosing accountability over appearance. She said this was not a triumph over a man, but a proof of concept that truth, when tended, can outlast a lie. When asked if she forgave Ethan, she did not offer an easy headline. Forgiveness, she said, lives on a timeline I will not rush. Today is about repair. The repair did not arrive as banners or slogans. It arrived at work that would have bored the cameras. The company signed a consent decree requiring independent oversight, granular audit trails, and training written by people who understood how bias hides inside procedure. The shadow loop became policy, not secret. HR reopened the drawer where ignored complaints slept and built a map of patterns that needed dismantling. Grace sat through meetings that stretched past dinner and into the humble hours where progress is made in sentences without adjectives. None of it was glamorous. All of it mattered. Ethan's remorse did not end at sentencing. Weeks later, Amara received a letter through counsel. No excuses, no requests, just an account of what it means to watch your name printed beside a number that is also a cage. He wrote about the first night, about how the hallway lights hummed like a low scold, about the small humiliations that teach a man the size of the world he made for others. He wrote that ambition without character is a blade, that he had carried it like a credential until it cut the wrong person and then cut him back. He wrote that he had begun tutoring men who could read parts of a manual but not their court filings, and that for the first time in years, his knowledge felt like a tool and not a weapon. He did not ask Amara to answer. He said he would spend every hour given to him paying down what could not be paid. Amara read the letter once in the kitchen with the window open to the evening. She folded it and set it beneath a stack of grant applications for the fund she had announced the day she walked free, a practical engine designed to help defendants whose innocence lacks a camera. She met with community elders and teenagers and paralegals and engineers. She learned the unglamorous vocabulary of budgets and bylaws and supervised release. She visited a neighborhood center where a retired librarian ran a reading group and spoke to them not about villains and heroes, but about systems and choices, about dignity as a daily practice. She told them the law can be late and still be law if we keep its path clear, that truth is patient but not passive, that character is what you do when no one has turned the camera on. Months passed, and the city adjusted in the way living things do incrementally, with setbacks, with stubbornness. A junior manager who had learned in silence now interrupted prejudice where it began, in small rooms. A policy that once measured fit as sameness was rewritten to measure readiness as skill. A juror who had watched the reversal volunteered at a clinic on Saturdays because he could not unhear his certainty. The lessons did not arrive as thunder. They arrived as new habits. On a mild afternoon, Amara stood at a podium in a modest auditorium and handed the first scholarships to students whose names would sit strangely in the mouths of rooms not yet ready for them. She told them the story in plain terms of weather and work. She did not name Ethan. She named the choices he made and the choices others had made to undo them. She named Ruth and Grace, and a judge who unsaid a sentence because the evidence required it. She named the value that anchored all of it, human dignity, not as ornament but as obligation. When the applause rose, it sounded less like celebration than like agreement. That night, alone, she walked past the courthouse on her way home. The windows reflected a quiet city, and for a moment, she saw her face layered over the stone and the sky. She did not feel victorious. She felt responsible. Justice had not arrived as a triumphal march. It had arrived as a reminder to keep the lights on in every hallway, to keep the records honest, to keep the doors open wide enough for the next person to enter and stand without apology. That was the bitter price, the late remorse, and the lasting lesson braided together. Lies can dazzle for a season, but character keeps time. Power can bend a verdict, but truth, tended with patience and care, returns to standing. And when it does, it asks not for cheers, but for hands. What this story leaves behind, once the headlines fade, is a clear, useful reminder of how a society protects its dignity, one careful habit at a time. A new hire walks into a room that didn't expect her and is measured by a stereotype instead of her work. A manager turns convenience into a plan, borrowing her good name to cover his bad choice. A courtroom reaches for closure before the facts have finished speaking. And then, piece by piece, steadier instincts take over. A leader refuses the comfort of a tidy lie and checks again. An engineer keeps a forgotten safeguard alive. A prosecutor changes course on the record. A judge unsays yesterday because evidence requires it. Truth does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives as a quiet accumulation of verifiable moments that survive scrutiny. The lesson is not abstract. Character is the posture you keep when accusation is loud and proof is slow. Dignity is the way we treat people when no one is clapping. Justice is not a single verdict, but the willingness to correct one. And truth endures not by being louder than falsehood, but by being better documented, better designed, and better tended. If we want workplaces and courts worthy of our trust, we can build them the same way this case was repaired, designed for doubt as well as trust. Keep independent records. Slow down when bias tries to speed you up. Share credit as quickly as you share blame, and make accountability precise enough to change future behavior, not theatrical enough to win a news cycle. For those of us watching, the next right step may be small and specific. Ask for evidence before certainty hardens. Keep minutes that reflect what happened. Leave space at the table for the voice that was easy to ignore last time. And when you discover you were wrong, correct it in the same tone you announced it. That is how character becomes culture, and how culture makes room for justice to breathe. If this reflection resonated with you, we invite you to add a gentle, thoughtful comment about the moment that stayed with you, or a practice you rely on when things get complicated. Your perspective helps others think without fear and speak without shouting. If you'd like more grounded stories that turn big ideas into practical lessons, please subscribe to our channel and explore our other videos. We'll keep sharing real cases that illuminate how truth and fairness win, not by accident, but by design. Thank you for spending time with this story and for listening with care. We wish you a new day that is steady, clear, and kind, and choices that give dignity a place to live.